to The Catholic Perspective, a podcast brought to you by rcspirituality.org. Enjoy the episode.
Some straight talk about science.
Remember Dr. Frankenstein? He was a brilliant scientist, way ahead of his time. By using patients as human guinea pigs, without them realizing it, of course, he was able to create a monster that led to death, destruction, misery, and tragedy. The story of Frankenstein is just that, a story. But it contains an important truth. The truth is this: just because we can do something, that doesn't mean we should do it. Just because we have the power, the knowledge, the technology to obliterate human life on Earth, for example, that doesn't mean we should go ahead and press the nuclear button. This is common sense. But sometimes we forget about common sense, especially when it comes to science. Science and technology, as Dr. Frankenstein discovered, can easily become blinding passions. The more we know about the world, the more we get the feeling that we can have total control over it. And since original sin has made us into controlaholics, a little taste of control can lead to a binge, and a few binges can create a frenzied addiction, and before you know it, Dr. Jekyll becomes Mr. Hyde, and mild-mannered Professor Smith becomes another Dr. Frankenstein. Exaggerations? Hardly. Just look at a few facts. Take, for example, United Nations-sponsored clinics and hospitals in South and Central America. They give special concern to pregnant indigenous women, helping with difficult deliveries at no charge, and then performing a sterilization operation on the mother once the baby has been born, without, of course, informing her or asking for her consent. Practices like these have made poor women in countries like Mexico and Brazil afraid to request any kind of medical attention at all, for fear that they will be forced or manipulated into treatments that they neither need nor want. Dr. Frankenstein would fit right in at clinics like those. He had no qualms about putting science at the service of discrimination. Or take the cutting-edge fertility clinics. Couples experiencing fertility difficulties go there for expert advice, but many of the experts recommend in vitro fertilization immediately, not even mentioning the many other treatments that don't resort to the artificial production of whole batches of human embryos. This unjust manipulation of the couple, entrusting themselves to the wonders of scientific progress, guarantees scientists a plentiful supply of frozen human embryos. Right now, conservative estimates say that at least 200,000 of them are in stock in the United States alone. These are then used for what they call research and experimentation. Behold, Frankenstein the fertility doctor. Advanced gene studies is another field especially vulnerable to the techno-binge mentality. In October 2002, Dr. James Watson, who helped discover the shape of DNA way back in 1953, gave a talk at the University of Toronto, in which he expressed his hopes that budding techniques of genetic manipulation could create a perfect future by making sure that undesirable humans never get born. Undesirable humans? Which ones are those? Perhaps Dr. Watson can consult Dr. Frankenstein to come up with a list. The false promise of total control, total autonomy, at the root of these and other abusive practices has led, in many cases, to a gluttonous pursuit of scientific knowledge and technological power. This pursuit has in turn, unfortunately, become one of modernity's false idols. It's an idol because it implicitly claims to do what only God can do: provide total human fulfillment. Because this view promises so much, like the eventual elimination of suffering and death, those who hold it refuse to accept any limits or conditions on their research activity, ethical conditions, for instance, and so they put themselves on the path forged by Frankenstein. But these promises are false, as are the promises of every idol. They are false because science is not God. It has inherent limits, and only by acknowledging and working within those limits will scientists fulfill their noble and essential role in the human family. Let's take a look at these 3 limits of science. Science is limited, first of all, in what it can tell us about the universe. Not everything can be explained by the scientific method, because the scientific method requires physically measurable data. But not everything is physically measurable. For instance, science can neither prove nor disprove the existence of angels. Nor can scientists quantify spiritual realities like friendship and love and greed and prayer. They may try to, but ultimately, realities like these are linked to human freedom, a phenomenon which doesn't fit in test tubes. Neither does the beauty of a poem, or a sunset, or a symphony. Simply to assume that they will someday fit into a test tube, which some devout scientific idolaters do, is to make an act of faith, not a calculation of science. Furthermore, even when science stays within the bounds of the physical world, many of its conclusions are not definitive. This is because particular physical phenomenon can often be explained in more ways than one. For instance, if the grass in your yard is wet, it may be because of a rain shower or your neighbor's hose. Science discovers a lot of wet yards in the universe and goes about trying to come up with plausible explanations of the moisture. This is why new theories are always popping up, correcting or replacing or challenging old theories. Consequently, scientific conclusions are, by definition, not always conclusive. Aristotle, Newton, and Einstein all explain projectile motion, but their explanations differ. So the first inherent limit of science is that it can't tell us everything about the universe. Secondly, science and technology are limited in what they can do for us. They can certainly help feed and cure the body, but they can't eliminate the need for food and health. They can help us understand the world around us and make better use of it, but they cannot satisfy the human heart. Happiness can never be reduced to physical well-being. The human person searches for a meaning, a purpose in life, which can't be found in a laboratory. The human person also needs to be loved and to love, and you can't find that in a petri dish. Technology, no matter how powerful, can't take the place of kindness. Finally, science and technology are also limited in what they ought to attempt. We all recoil in horror when we consider the gruesome experiments that Nazi scientists conducted on prisoners. Certainly they advanced medical science by their detailed studies of the physiological effects of hypothermia on the human body, and maybe their conclusions could even be used eventually to save lives. But does that justify the calculated murder of dozens of human beings by monitoring them as they froze to death in the icy waters of laboratory swimming pools? No. Science is not just limited by what it can tell us about the universe and by what it can do for us, but also by what it should do. Whenever science and technology ignore these limits which are obvious to common sense, they become dangerous idols. Idols that feed human arrogance and inspire scientists to follow the lead of Dr. Frankenstein, ostensibly pursuing greater peace and prosperity, but leaving in their wake a tragic trail of human wreckage. One of the duties of the Church is to keep common sense common. Like a good mother, she keeps an eye on her children, so we don't put ourselves in dangerous situations where we can get hurt. That's why the Church is never tired of reminding us that scientists must respect the inherent limits of science and technology. It issues this reminder by constantly calling to mind one simple principle. Science must always be at the service of every human person and the whole human community. Science is for people, not people for science. Here's how Pope John Paul II put it in his speech for the Jubilee of Scientists. Quote, "You are asked to work in a way that serves the good of individuals and of all humanity, while always being attentive to the dignity of every human being and to respect for creation." End quote. The Second Vatican Council put the same thought more succinctly. Quote, "With an increase in human power comes a broadening of responsibility on the part of individuals and communities." End quote. It's the Frankenstein lesson all over again. Just because we can do something, that doesn't mean that we should do it. People must always come first. The Church will remind scientists and society of that basic truth as often as necessary. But the Church's relationship with science goes deeper than a mother's gentle and firm reminder of its dangers and limits. It esteems and encourages scientific inquiry and technological advance. It recognizes that the scientific endeavor, when it respects its inherent limits, has a noble and essential role to play in the human drama. A twofold role of discovering the wonders of creation and harnessing them for the good of the human family. That's really what true scientific progress is all about. That's how it can give glory to God, and that's why the Church is pro-science. To quote the Second Vatican Council again, quote, "Far from considering the conquests of man's genius and courage as opposed to God's power, Christians ought to be convinced that the achievements of the human race are a sign of God's greatness and the fulfillment of His mysterious design. There is no question, then, of the Christian message inhibiting men from building up the world or making them disinterested in the good of their fellows. On the contrary, it is an incentive to do these very things." End quote. Science and the Church, in other words, are allies. Of course, that's not the prevailing view. Distorted versions of the infamous Galileo affair have popularized the idea that the Church is anti-science. Those distortions are so grand that it took an entire talk to correct them. But even the distortions can't undo history, and the history of the Church shows that it has been a bulwark of support for the scientific endeavor, even if it has consistently refused to commit scientific Frankensteinian idolatry by ignoring the natural limits of science and technology. From founding the first modern universities, to building the first astronomical observatory, to pioneering modern genetics, Catholics have always been in the forefront of the scientific enterprise. In fact, as the esteemed historian of science Stanley Yockey has shown in his masterful work, Science and Creation, modern science itself was conceived only in the fertile womb of Catholic culture. It was stillborn everywhere else. And the Church's present-day commitment to furthering the scientific enterprise only supports its historical record. Just think, for instance, of the thousands of Catholic schools, universities, and research institutes all over the world. Or look at the composition and activity of the Pontifical Academy of Science, an international think tank made up of Catholics, non-Catholics, and even atheists, sponsored by the Vatican in order to foster healthy science and a fruitful dialogue between science and faith. Calling the Catholic faith anti-science is like calling honeybees anti-honey. As faithful Catholics, then, we should welcome, contribute to, and enjoy true scientific and technological progress as a way of giving glory to the God who made the universe and gave us minds to appreciate and understand it. But we should always remember that science can't tell us everything, can't solve all our problems, and can easily be abused. Just because we can do something, it doesn't mean that we should do it. Like when our ancestors first invented the bow and arrow, some of them undoubtedly used it to improve their hunting techniques and increase the community's food supply. But others, filled with a Frankensteinian thirst for domination and control, soon discovered that they could use it to dominate their neighbors. May we always promote the former approach and obstruct the latter. And that's some straight talk about science.
You have been listening to The Catholic Perspective, a resource from rcspirituality.org. Please visit our website and check out more great resources to help you pray, learn, grow, and go. Please join our team of digital missionaries by subscribing at rcspirituality.org.